I'm Jen, and this is Malika. Hey, welcome. Come on in. Hey, we work together on the analytics team analysis of the subject campy was here, and we worked alongside Nicole and Ryder, who couldn't be here today, but we all, work together on that weekend and then also here. We today. Oh, could you go to the next slide, Golly? So, we're going to talk about exploring voter engagement using open data to prevent funding. And we're going to talk about the use of voting data in campaign contexts, the state of voter turnout in New York City, factors contributing to low voter turnout, policy interventions to improve turnout based on those factors, and bringing open data into this analysis. And then we're going to have a breakout discussion together. This presentation will include high-level overview of factors contributing to voter turnout and introducing some publicly available data sources, but it won't include a comprehensive analysis of those data sets, just to kind of level set with you all. Also, we're referencing a number of policy interventions in this presentation, and we're surfacing ideas that are already in the literature, and we're advocating for using data to inform implementation of those policies and also to evaluate their efficacy, not for certain ones in particular. So just to kind of flag that for you all.
And so as get started, we're going to talk a little bit more about data in the campaign context, how we leverage different open data available there before pivoting into New York City open data specifically, and using that to explore voter turnout. So there are a lot of different data sources that come into play in a campaign context, around polling to fundraising to big media. But the heart of our roles is really looking at voting data and early voting returns, and voter registration. So in terms of the data sets that we use to look at that kind of activity, we would look at both voter registration data, which is public across many states, to understand the volume of voter rolls in areas, how they were registered, and who they were when available in terms of demographics. Often companies or campaigns will also partner with funders for more robust and rich voter files. Then they provide things like model demographics when it's not available, or in a campaign context, we work closely with data science teams where they will be able to provide additional support scores or turnout scores, helping us try to gauge what's the record on a voter file, how they might be likely to turn out, or candidates they might be likely to support. But nearly every state, there is public voter registration data available as well. And there's a larger kind of conversation this year about differences between states and benefits of public voter registration data, but also safeguards need to be put into place. So I will quickly plug an article at techdemocracy.org. They have a great resource on just why voter registration data is public, and kind of the nuances surrounding that and nuances between different states. But secondly, something that was pretty nifty about a lot of the data that we used in our day-to-day reporting and that helped spark a general interest in just helping people understand that this data is available is that a lot of pieces like voting data and election results are provided on state secretary sites and on county board of election sites. So up here to have an example from the state of Nevada, where they would actually keep their Secretary of State site updated with reports and CSVs throughout the election that were downloadable by anyone, providing both aggregated by county and by party total returns over time. And they also provided something called like a voter crosswalk, where at a voter record ID, you could track their ballot status, as well as other fields such as ballot receipt date, ballot mail date, their voting location to understand where they were actually going to vote, if it was early in person, and different fields like that. And so we would use this data both to understand the current trend of what was happening in terms of voting, who was turning out to vote so far, and how that aligned to expectations, both looking at current returns and historical data for comparison to benchmark where possible. And then lastly, for helping investigate context questions or grounding data in just the general context of what was happening, we could also use data sets like the US Census Bureau data sets for general population trends, as well as there are some other great resources online like MIT Election Lab has a lot of historical ballot return data available at a precinct level. So you can look at things like ballot returns historically over time to compare to something like the ongoing ballot return activity that you're getting now. And yeah, in the campaign, like we had some amazing analytics engineers that would undertake the feat of like ingesting, cleaning, and joining voter and result information across all of these counties and states that provide data in various ways into usable recording models and tables for us. Next slide, please. Thank you. So those reporting tables and models are what Jen and I, as analysts, would then work on to actually leverage data and like understand and report on those. And so the three kind of ways that we did those were, firstly, we used it every day for regular reporting. We were able to report on daily voting returns and synthesize trends by voter blocks and geographies, have a clear set of metrics to share out for stakeholders, like senior leadership on the campaign, communications teams to help inform the narrative there, as well as program teams to help inform and shift budget strategies. We also built dashboards and visualization tools layered on top of the data there for ongoing access to folks to have access to those updating results. And the graphics on the right here are examples that other organizations have created, such as Target Smart and the Election Lab of Florida, where they similarly used this early voting data to create these dashboards and visualizations so folks can have access to voting to the information. So these reports, dashboards, and metrics were then able to plug into informing programs by doing things like helping allocate resources, curating voter outreach lists, curing rejected ballots when we had ballot status data information, and overall just assist real-time media planning, budget strategy shifts, and like pulling those levers. And there are, of course, a lot of pieces to the puzzle in terms of the data that comes together to do those kinds of things, but just to give an idea of the conversations this data could help inform. And then it also helped with more granular questions of assessing impact, where we could wield it to try to measure effects in voter turnout after notable campaign moments, rallies, and more significant events at hyperlocal levels to try to evaluate how that might have affected voting in those regions or any significant impact of certain efforts or programs. So now our collaboration will shift to where we're at, New York. And so it may be apparent that voting data was top of our minds for a lot of last year. And so when we saw this headline in December in an Optimist article about being number 49, second to last in voter turnout among major cities, our jurors were definitely turning a little bit, and they wanted to be like, okay, why? We like looked so much at turnout data, and how can we now pivot to our local community, the city in which we live, and try to understand what data is available here to help us assess this question and evaluate this question. And so we'll go into that a little bit more in the latter half of the presentation. So first, I just wanted to walk through some of the stats and lay of the land of the current state of voter turnout in New York. And so some key data points include this number about being 49th out of 50, followed only by El Paso. And this is all based off of the UC San Diego study, which has a lot of great research on voter turnout across major cities. So definitely, yeah, feel free to dig further into that as well. But in 2024, New York City's turnout rate was 54%. And this was still more than double the 2021 mayoral race, which was 23%, which notably New York does have odd year elections, which is something that Jen will dive a little bit deeper into how that may contribute to lower voter turnout in those years. But something else that we wanted to call out is that New York State also falls in the bottom 10 among states nationally for voter turnout overall as well. And in terms of like that turnout difference between 2020 and 2024 and how that affected the outcome of this election, which notably in New York shifted more to the right, I wanted to quote Jasmine Gripper, who's the co-director of New York's Working Families Party, that the voters didn't overwhelmingly go to the Republican side. They just stayed at home and didn't vote. And another quote I liked that I wanted to surface from Stephen Rybalewski, director of the Senior Mapping Service, was that in a way, New York got redder because it got less blue. which I think can also be illustrated by the statistic on Staten Island voting, where the Democrat candidate lost 25,000 votes between 2020 to 2024, while Trump only gained 1,000. The next slide, yes. And so to drill a little bit deeper into turnout by groups to help understand the current state of things and maybe understanding what you're starting to turn out less, the group Equity NYC leveraged some data to create some great visualizations that are accessible on their website that we pulled from to look a little bit deeper into the current state of voter turnout. Currently, this data is looking at 2016 to 2022. And so by borough, apologies, I think it's cut off a little bit, but by borough, we see that Manhattan and Staten Island saw the highest rates of turnout, while the Bronx saw the lowest. And that over time, in terms of temporal trends, turnout rates slightly increased in the 2020 presidential election versus 2016, likely also influenced by the pandemic, which exacerbated the usage of absentee voting, though otherwise it has continued to dip, where we saw nearly an 8% dip between the last two midterm cycles in turnout. Now zooming into neighborhood, on this map, the light darker shading represents areas that turned out at higher rates. And here we're defining turnout as the number of voters that casted a vote over the number of registered voters. And the lighter regions of this map are lower turnout rates. So by neighborhood in Manhattan, lower Manhattan, excluding Lower East Side and Chinatown, and the Upper East Side and Upper West Side had the highest turnout rates in 2022, with the latter two neighborhoods of Upper East Side and Upper West Side seeing the strongest overall. Then in Brooklyn, Fort Greene, and Park Slope saw the highest turnout, and then other top turnout neighborhoods included Bayside in Queens and Tottenville and Staten Island. And notably, like when kind of cross-referencing with what the wealthier and more upper middle class neighborhoods across the county are, there is kind of an initial correlation that can be gleaned here. And then lastly, by looking at age group, we see that older voters, particularly age 50 through 70, have the highest turnout rates among age groups. And then when we look at over time, between midterm cycles, going back, it's got like 8% dip over time, we see that younger voters have had the largest drop-off in turnout, with folks aged 18 to 29 dipping about 12 percentage points, 30 to 39 about 10, which then in comparison, when we look at older voter groups, we see that folks 70 plus dipped about 2 percentage points. So now that we have this context, we're probably thinking a little bit more about what are some potential factors that contribute to folks staying at home or not turning out to vote generally. So I'll hand it back to Jen to discuss a sample of some of those.
Cool. Hey. Could you go next? Thank you. So what factors contribute to a low turnout rate? We have some data here on
Can you tell us what the whole title would be on this slide?
Oh, yeah. Factors contributing to low turnout and potential program and policy intervention. I guess. Yeah, sorry about that.
I actually do want to apologize.
No, don't worry. Hey. Oh no. First, I suggested something that's making it work. I know there's a way to do it, but hide floating mini controls. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, some factors have been listed on the left, and their related potential policy interactions on the right. And so our team looked through the literature, plucked out a few key factors here. The first thing that voter registration is tedious. Voting itself can be pesky and can be time-consuming. Folks may not vote if they're not interested in politics or following news, and folks that must have to vote if they reside in a neighborhood that's underserved. We're going to focus on these four because they're key factors, but also because they map well to a number of policy interventions. So as you might be able to imagine, there are other factors that maybe don't have a program that can be implemented to kind of adjust that particular factor. So, for example, Same-day voter registration, including on election day, can help eliminate some of the tedium of registering to vote and some of the having to keep track of multiple dates problem of having voter registration separate from billing itself. Voting could be potentially less pesky if anyone could go for now without having to give a reason. Civic education in schools down here that could spark an interest in politics for soon-to-be voters that could then result in them deciding to vote and maybe have age. And using messaging while canvassing that highlights voting as a feedback method for public services could increase turnout in underserved neighborhoods. So before we talk more about each of these potential policy,
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just wondering in terms of, because I speak like 2 different languages.
yeah,
So for the, and no worries if it's not, but for the information, especially in the last one, did you guys look over, is there any literature on looking at voters whose primary language is not English?
yes, I don't talk about it here, but that is also a policy intervention that people recommend, offering materials in additional languages. Oh, so definitely, that's your take point. Yeah, this is like a subset of proposed ideas, but that is also a good one. Yeah,
Maybe I misunderstood. Is the set of sort of 4 kind of categories on the left seem to be the major factors influencing low turnout?
yes. So I would say yes and no. Yes, in that they're key factors, but there are other, for example, demographic characteristics like gender that are also associated with lower turnout. But I focused on these because they map better to policies that can be implemented. So I was thinking about gender, for example, like women might have lower turnout because they have more responsibilities in the home, more caregiving responsibilities, and not necessarily going to be able to implement a program that changes the gender dynamics of our society and frees up a lot of time for women. For example,
Could I just ask, what are some, if you had to name like a few of the really major things that influence low turnout that are really hard to influence by individual campaigns or voter outreach campaigns?
I feel like the gender dynamics is one example. I feel like for now, I'd love to stick with these, and then maybe we can explore that more after, as some of the other factors come up in some of the diagrams that come up, because there'll be survey questions where they mention these factors and some others. So can we circle back to that? I like the question though. Yeah.
So mine was it was driven by a survey, or you guys just came up with these ideas?
No, they're driven by the research, and we're going to go through each one by one. There are some references on the bottom. There's much more literature on each of these 4, but we decided to highlight, these 4 because of survey research, essentially, that demonstrates some of the research really key factors. Yeah, and for additional context, I am not doing this research myself. This is from a literature review, so I promise we're not plucking these out of the air. We're just throughout the same things that researchers and experts that study this have said are main factors. Thank you for your questions. Okay. So before we talk more about interventions and measuring their effects, let's talk through each of these factors one by one. Critique it. Easy one.
Nope, didn't work. Just kidding.
Do you not have another slide after this?
Nothing more.
Oh.
What's about good?
So just want to augment back to that question about other kind of factors, things like that, is that we also at the end have some kind of guided breakout questions, which I think are in that similar theme. We'd also definitely love all of y'all's input to questions and thoughts. I really should so have so much experience in these sectors. So yeah, just want Auguri's time again to discuss on those questions, what else comes into play, and what could we be looking at?
Other factors, other policy dimensions, as well. Thank you. Bye. Okay, so the first factor we're going to talk about is the TM of voter registration. So most people registering are young people who are brand new to the voting process. They don't necessarily know how far ahead of election day you need to register or where to find that information. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry, it's just.
No, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, awesome. Okay, thank you. So the different gates for registering to vote, there are multiple depending on participating. The general or the primary two are not necessarily common knowledge. Also, just anecdotally, I sometimes register voters as a volunteer, and I feel like in general, people seem like very relieved to get this off their to-do list and to have someone to ask questions to. So it definitely can be a barrier to people, especially young people who are brand new to voting. Also, just another note on voter registration and these timelines. Often voter registration closes before an election becomes a big topic of conversation, so it can block new voters from participating if they're thinking about election day as the big date coming up and not also the voter registration date. Hey,
Oh, so sorry.
hey, you're good.
One last question. Did these studies take into account the voter? There's like voter laws that changed, I think, in 2021 or 2022 in New York, where like there were all these different changes to like same day voter registration and all these different things and not ranked tracing. But does this take into account?
So some of them are from before and some of them are after.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. Yeah, but I was looking at voter registration deadlines this morning, just trying to double check things. And yeah, the primary one is the June 25, which I feel like is kind of a little bit unexpectedly early versus for the general, it's October 25 cents much closer, but I feel like you could easily miss participating in a primary because you're not thinking midsummer about registering to vote. Okay, could you go to the last one? So another factor that comes up for people in certain research is that voting is easy but a little bit annoying. It could conflict with work or school. And the Board of Elections sees the highest in-person voting activity before or after work hours, meaning it's like really elongating people's days potentially. Lines can be long. It could be tricky or stressful to make sure you did all your paperwork correctly if you're voting absentee. And a 2019 survey of eligible voters in New York State found that 62% would be likely to vote in an election. Those held on a weekend are more likely. 28% missed the election due to work or school obligations. 76% would be more likely to vote if no excuse absentee voting was enacted. So being able to vote absentee without providing a reason. 18% shared that they missed an election due to not knowing the day of the election, and 12% could not get an absentee ballot. And then to kind of draw our attention over here, this top chart shows us in 2023 the total population of eligible voters, and then we see the subset of it is actually registered to vote. So people perhaps getting stymied by some of the factors that we talked about on the last slide. And then an even smaller percentage are actually voting. And I want to class for us that this is 2023 and hot year. And Malika initially brought this up, but one idea that people have in New York for increasing voter turnout is switching these odd election years, which we see down here with extraordinarily low voter turnout, could perhaps increase voter turnout to have those on even years. So just to kind of fly hospital bat sizes. Could you better thanks, sorry?
Chips.
Oh, thank you. Another factor contributing to low turnout is the lack of interest in politics. So a 2021 survey found that voter 10 swing states cited a lack of interest in politics as the rationale for why they weren't registered to vote. And researchers have also found that non-voter social circles tend to include fellow non-voters, and voter social circles tend to include fellow voters. To show that kind of like finds like and that people tend to gravitate towards other people with similar interests. Non-voters also shared in survey research them what's comfortable with others making major decisions that impact them in comparison to voters. And we also see that they consume different media. So over here we can see that voters are much more likely to follow politics news closely than non-voters. So, and then a third factor that influences low voter turnout is residence in an underserved neighborhood. So voter turnout is lower in food insecure and low-income communities. And this in itself is due to a variety of factors, including historical voter suppression and disenfranchisement efforts that fuels the lack of trust in government and political institutions. And also, these communities sometimes have lower access to transportation or a decreased ability to get themselves to a polling place. Did you listen? So let's zoom back out. We kind of we drilled down into these 4 factors and talk again about some of the potential policy interventions that open data could inform. And we could measure the efficacy of using open data that map onto these factors. And we've touched on a number of them already. So it could be helpful to have single voter registration on election day, automatic voter registration, which we're already expecting and is in the works, potentially pushing that primary voter registration deadline back, for huskiness of voting, potentially switching city election to even-numbered years to align with even-year state or federal election would pick up quite a little bit. Moving election day to a weekend, multi-week early voting periods can extend that period that people can vote, and being able to vote on Sunday without providing an excuse. And in terms of sparking interest in politics and overcoming the lack of interest that results in some people not voting, it could be helpful to develop a civic engagement fellowship program to expand these students' esteemed voter education and civic engagement programs and strengthening civic education in schools. And in terms of increasing turnout in underserved neighborhoods, it could be helpful to expand and improve canvassing efforts and also using messaging that highlights voting as a feedback method for services in a way to sound. Can you go to the next one? So how can open data in combination with the factors and policy interventions we've been discussing help with alleviating low voter turnout? Well, it can help in kind of all phases of the process. So it could help determine who should be reached out to in terms of canvassing efforts. It could help us identify neighborhoods that have our communities that high turnout, see what lessons we could learn there. And it could also help us measure the efficacy of different programs if we look at what turnout looks like before a program is implemented versus after to see a shift occurs.
So part of why we're all here today is to learn more about open data and the data that is available from the city and public resources. So we wanted to introduce y'all to a few data sets that can help folks either perform similar analyses, some of the metrics and things that we had highlighted earlier in the presentation about New York voting. And then also just show you how you can use New York City open data in particular to then make these more robust, to create visualization tools, to create data resources for informing programs if you all are trying to work in that for turnout and engagement space and answer some of the kinds of questions that Jen raised. And so BetaNYC has a lot of great public information about election data. So they provide voter enrollment totals. So this is voters registered by county, election district, city council district, and municipal court district levels. So at these very geolocation levels, they provide use totals overall. And then the site also provides vote result data in PDF and CSV format of these total votes at a county and election district level. We will note that, and Jen will also go into this a little bit more, but the CSVs can require some data cleaning and manipulation, but that these initial resources of votes, both at a candidate level and total turnout, are available into the public there. And then outside of New York, also wanted to surface this additional resource where I'm sure many people may follow along. New York Times had a lot of analysis surrounding the election map, on election night itself and following. And they recently surfaced their GitHub, which shares the data and files behind that election map. So if people wanted to look at both the results data as well as take in those precinct level shape files for being able to build out maps, that is available publicly as well. Huge next slide, please. And then, of course, New York City Open Data also hosts a variety of data sets that are super helpful for performing this kind of analyses. So one big data set that often referenced in actually a lot of the studies that we conducted that review on is they have this robust voter analysis data set from 2018, which has records on active voters and 10 years of their voting history with things like geographic metadata and information on a voting history of those prior 10 years, and has records for over 4 million voters and a handy data dictionary alongside it on the site, which is super helpful for election information to kind of be able to glean about those voters. And then it also, some supporting data sets available on New York City Open Data. They have an election district shapefile, which has location data for election districts, which, as we referenced, BetaNYC publishes enrollment totals and results at an election district level. So this data set is great for being able to then join those together to create visualizations. And then there's also some information on poll sites, where they again have that geolocation information available if you want to build out data visualizations, as well as metadata about things like the accessibility of poll sites and how that looks in different neighborhoods, which will help answer kind of more targeted program questions or help us understand how kind of things like polling sites maybe placed in distribution in certain neighborhoods.
Next slide.
Yes, thank you. And so I'll hand it back to Jen to kind of walk through a little bit of an overview of how some of those data sets translated into real coding and visualizations of things.
Yeah. So I'm just going to do a little case study that just walks through with broad strokes the different steps going into building a resource like this. This is just in voter enrollment by election district. I can use a little word to be that useful, but I thought it just so be helpful. I feel like variety of like experiences and skill sets in the room to kind of talk through in broad strokes how you might go from taking these data sets to answering the questions you want to answer. So first and foremost, identifying the question you want to answer, then thinking about what data sets you need, perhaps some of the ones that Malika discussed, to answer that question. And so, like, for example, here, we were like, okay, like, it'd be interesting to look at voter enrollment by election district. So we were like, okay, we need one of the two I used here, the shapefile of election districts from Open Data, which Malika mentioned, is used here, along with enrollment data by election district from the New York State for elections. So then you would, identify this data sets, download them, feed them into your program of choice. Malika mentioned that you might need to do a little cleaning. We saw those PDFs and these kind of the spacing might be a little awkward. I had to, cut some rows at the top, change the types of some different variables. Then you can, combine them together, merge the data sets. You might want to make additional calculations. Like what I wish you would have done here is also launched in census data to get a sense of population size per election district, to get a better sense of what these enrollment numbers mean. I think right now they just maybe a proxy for the size of each election district. And then using different packages, I use Pandas and a Stipolium package to create visualizations that can help you understand perhaps the impact of the program or how things vary across the city. There are a ton of different questions you could answer with these different data sets. And with tools like this, we have some examples down here. So it could be interesting to look at census data along with voter enrollment to see where people need to be sent for voter registration efforts. And for each of these, I feel like this process is really similar. You're thinking about your research question, thinking about what open data sets can help you answer it, downloading them, merging them. Perhaps you're looking at voter registration before and after an intervention. So you might want to look at the difference between voter registration in a certain area and visualize that and see how much it's changed or not changed to see how effective that program is. It could be useful to look at polling place data on open data and see how accessible that is based on different geographical areas to see if that could be affecting people's accessibility to turning out to vote. So there are a lot of different directions you could go with all of these different data sources and the great tools that are out there. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about next. So if you could go to the next slide, we have a few discussion questions that we thought we could kind of break into small groups to go over. If you all want to start forming those groups now, but basically we wanted to all discuss with each other what factors did we not discuss yet, and what programs do you think would be effective? What research questions you all have? Thank you for listening.
Yeah, we'll take a minute to make session group, maybe come back out and share as a wider group. I think that kind of part of our goal here today was to hopefully empower you all with a little bit more knowledge on the state voter turnout in New York and some a start of sense of what contributed to that, but then also fully acknowledging that there is a variety of limitations that come into play and a variety of ways that this can go on to be measured. So now that you have the sense of some of the sets that could be used, also starting to think about what other data would be helpful there and how would you want to measure that impact of any proposed additional ideas. So maybe we'll take 10 or so minutes in breakout groups and then
What's that say?
Awesome. So we'll go around the room and if each group of people could just share kind of key things they talked about in terms of factors or data sets they were interested in. Heard a lot of great bits and pieces of conversation. Who'd definitely love to just open up those conversations across the wider room. So maybe you start over. Yeah, you're in. Go around now.
I prepared long. So you were at that routine board.
We talked about socioeconomic status, so who voted, who didn't. We also talked about maybe getting more granular data, zooming in on a district and seeing the difference between red versus blue and getting more personal. You were anything else?
Just asking also voters what would be, instead of just why didn't you vote, what would make you more likely to vote, or what are say things that could help you make easier for you to vote, because just getting that input about the potential interventions from voters.
Sir. One of the things you can actually explore is looking at the actual voting data itself. So looking at their voting history, you can find people who vote in the general election, but not the local election. Or, so that information is valuable because if you're running for a candidacy, they took at the voter data and they reach out to only the people that voted in the past in local election and not the folks who are that discrepancy involved. So there is a strategic process to learn about this. And from my understanding is that there's a disillusionment. If you talk to those citizens, they have an explanation for, and it's a very powerful explanation, but we'll go further to that.
Well, and then civic education, Drew. But that was a base. I love that. I love voter level granularity and trying to understand more just from the voters themselves, what motivates them to vote and what keeps them from voting or solutions out. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. The next there.
I took some notes, but essentially, and other folks in the chat watch. Essentially, we were talking about the challenges to measuring local interventions within data sets and how there's a lag time after legislation is passed, and then the communications might not be chronologically aligned with those changes in policy. And there were suggestions about comparative studies across different cities within those types of situations to get a more a better data set or more information that can help sort of overcome those difficulties in measurement. And another thing we talked about was sorry, help me out here.
Oh, no worries. The different
language barriers related to voting and how we can sort of change that, change the communications and how there's distrust and why there's distrust and how different information is getting to these different populations. Like I mentioned, like the COVID vaccine and the distrust and how would we sort of factor that in, but also create an actual data set, because that is a very qualitative aspect, and including that in the data set, especially in relation to everything that's happening within regards to like deporting and everything that's happening within the new administration. And then we also talked about voter turnout in terms of whether or not that includes voter engagement, i.e. what happened with the DNCC. You know, there's a lot of uncommitted votes, and how do you factor in those people and how do you get those people, and would you include that as voter turnout, because that's sort of a protest vote, but those people are informed, but they're not voting, if that makes sense.
Totally, yeah. That differentiation, I think, between like turnout and engagement is super interesting, of just casting a vote versus like how folks feel about the vote they're casting, how engaged they feel in the process. I thought, yeah. And about the idea of like this kind of broader quality of the data set. Curious to speak to.
Cool. I'll hand it to the crew back there, or
talk a little about like how it might be useful to compare the other big cities that have a
I'm sorry, compare the other what?
the other bigger cities that would have like a higher voter turnout with regard to what policies they might have, and compare that data to New York State. For example, California just yes everyone to mail ballots, and given the like kind of mail ballots can here you have to like go and opt for an absentee ballot. I wonder it's like how we wonder how much of that difference can help like the comparison between how what other policies we can adopt from bigger cities or like other states or other big cities, and then also overall from different countries. So you're trying to like understand how like voting in our other like our countries what's like happening, and how what were like useful things there.
I love that. I love that both y'all sort of thought too in terms of like not reinventing the wheel, but also learning from other cities and countries in terms of like programs and data and research they've already conducted too. That's like super important.
If I could go really quickly.
I'll take it. Was you had to raise hand somewhere? Or I'm sorry. If not, then we'll finish going around the room. Cool, and then we'll get to know. Who do we go back corner there?
Sure. Yeah, we talked about a bunch of things. So we talked about we're like understanding like why are people turning out? Like what election motivated that to go there? That's data which is hard to get there. We talked a little bit about that. Like in some states, you actually get commissioners like when people request out, so you don't have to. So you already know that they're voting, so you don't have to direct resources to them, and I can say resources to help like direct you around. I'll replace it. We also talked a bunch about like what does it mean when you have a general election which is like less competitive, right? Like how much does like having not competitive elections about being a swing state, right? Like how much does that drive turnout, and like how do you counteract them by like thinking policy all level stuff like that.
Yeah, I would add on like some of the analysis around like comparing us to swing states. It's hard in, our city when you go to an election and you know what the outcome is going to be. Like, what does it really tell you about the decision to vote or not? It kind of sheds light on some of the limitations of an approach, a granular approach, because, for instance, the Electoral College is something that really inhibits democracy within New York State, right? That's not a policy intervention. We can just sneak in there at this platform. But I think we should think about those bigger questions because broadly speaking, in our country and other Western democracies, there is a decay in trust of democracy and feeling like the voting system is actually serving the needs. So those are some things that are hard to measure, but highly impactful in the way that people are actually feeling about their decisions.
But why?
Absolutely, yeah. There are so much larger like structural conversations and questions at play as well. And I think also going back to some of like those youth voter turnout dip metrics that we highlighted earlier, I think a lot of that is connected to that point you brought up about like the voter apathy or the feeling that you already know the outcome of the election. And there's increasing studies showing that like youth voters are increasingly feeling this way. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Cool. It's a nice group.
Well, we discussed the problems around
the messaging in local elections that the vote is a form of triggering the feedback loop, particularly in underserved communities and some of the issues that arise in impressing upon voters in those communities. And a good deal of the issue stems from the fact that, to a large degree, public institutions haven't adopted some of the tactics and techniques that private institutions have in terms of messaging, in terms of psychological profiling, I guess other marketing tools, and getting people to realize what's at stake, right? Like perhaps that they've invested something in the process already. Like you were using today's weather as a comparison. It's good enough that it would draw people away from having to stay inside, but if they've already made some investment in the process, I pay for a ticket, that induces them to stay more likely than it would be if they had not. And so we were exploring some of those methods.
Yeah, like messaging to get people to understand like what voting bees are using it also as a feedback mechanism for their communities and like helping them understand that voting can also be sharing their voice for how they feel, not like a current state of what they are. Like regards what they feel well. Well, I think that we're all set time for the last group super quick and then help.
Two things. So this was about what data would you want to use to measure the impact of these proposed ideas. One, instead of just quantitative data, also getting qualitative data about the why and the how from local community groups, especially those groups that have maybe strong ethnic ties and so on, where there's more trust coming from individual community leaders who can ask questions maybe in a more discussion format and summarize, similar to what was done with the NYC evaluation that got published several years ago. Second, backlash. Like effective voter outreach gets backlash. Look at what happened to Acorn in 2009. They were effective at voter registration. So some right-wing jerks lied about them and got the community dissolved by saying that they were committing criminal acts when they weren't. So part of the data you would want is the backlash. If you're effective, people will fight against you.
Well, thank you all for such great conversation, ideas, questions. Please, everyone, dapat mampir juga.